Hello everyone, welcome to Frightful Whispers. I'm here to guide you into the shadows tonight. I know you're using this video to unwind and drift off to sleep. So, before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? Now, get cozy, relax, and let the whispers of the night take over. I don't know why we chose this place. I wish I could say it was the charm, the isolation, the promise of a fresh start. But deep down, I knew there was something else pulling us here. When Emily and I decided to leave everything behind, our old life, our broken dreams, the suffocating weight of the city, we were desperate. We needed something new, a place where we could rebuild, where we could escape. So, we found this house. It was out in the middle of nowhere, tucked away at the edge of a forest, where the trees seemed to stand guard, their limbs twisted like old hands reaching toward the sky. There was no one around for miles, nothing but the promise of solitude. It should have felt like peace, but it didn't. As soon as we turned onto that narrow, winding road, the air felt heavier. The trees loomed over us, their shadows stretching long and dark in the fading light. I could feel the pressure building, like something was watching us, something waiting for us to arrive. The road was narrow, the kind of place that felt like it could swallow you whole if you weren't careful. The farther we went, the quieter it became. The world outside seemed to disappear. I glanced over at Emily, her face pale, her eyes wide, staring out the window as though searching for something in the shadows. "Do you feel that?" she asked quietly. I shook my head. "What? Like, we're being watched?" Her voice trembled slightly, as though she were speaking more to herself than to me. I tried to brush it off. "It's nothing, just nerves, that's all." But something in her tone made me uneasy. I pressed the gas pedal a little harder, trying to push away the creeping sense that we were being drawn toward something that we couldn't understand yet. I thought about the past, the mistakes we'd both made, the things we'd buried that we couldn't outrun. I thought maybe this house could be a refuge, a way to leave it all behind. But when we crested the last hill and the house finally came into view, I knew deep down that it was already too late. The house was ancient, weathered, its stone foundation cracked like old bones. Ivy crawled up its sides, and the roof sagged under the weight of years of neglect. The windows were black, empty eyes that stared back at us as if they knew our secrets. The porch, once grand, now looked like a forgotten relic, sagging and broken. It was the kind of place you found in old ghost stories. The kind of place you shouldn't go, no matter how much you wanted to escape. I parked the car, the engine's soft hum the only sound in the growing silence. Emily didn't say anything. She just stared at the house, her lips parted, her hands clenched in her lap. "This is it," she whispered, though it didn't sound like the hopeful statement I expected. Her voice wavered, unsure. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The house felt like it was alive, breathing, waiting. There was something unsettling in the air, something thick, like the calm before a storm. But what really got to me were the trees. They were too close to the road, too oppressive, leaning inward like they were trying to trap us here, keeping us from leaving. I didn't like how they watched us. I pulled myself out of the car, the crunch of gravel underfoot the only noise that seemed to exist in the world. Emily followed me slowly, her eyes never leaving the house. She seemed drawn to it, like a moth to a flame. "I'll get the keys," I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice felt too tight. She nodded absently, still staring at the house as if she could see something in the windows, something I couldn't. Something that knew we were here. I turned to head toward the door, but as I did, I heard it. The creak of the old rocking chair on the porch. It was slow, deliberate, as though someone had just gotten up from it. But there was no one there. The chair moved again, rocking back and forth, just a little, as though waiting for someone to return to it. I froze, a chill creeping down my spine. The movement was too smooth, too purposeful. I shook my head, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But the wind was still, and the chair moved with such an eerie rhythm that I couldn't ignore it. Behind me, I heard Emily exhale sharply. "Do you see that?" I turned to her, following her gaze toward the house. "What?" There's something in the window." Her voice was tight with fear now, her body rigid. I didn't see anything, but that didn't matter. The house knew we were here. It had been waiting for us. I moved toward the front door, feeling the weight of every step. The old wood groaned beneath my feet, as if the house was complaining about the intrusion. The air inside was cold, unnaturally so, and thick with dust. I could smell it in the air, stale and heavy, like the house had been holding its breath for decades. The faintest light from the hallway flickered on, casting a dim glow over the peeling wallpaper and cracked floorboards. It felt like something was inside this house, something old and patient, something that had been waiting for us. And for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The air was too thick, the silence too heavy. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me with a bang, making my heart leap in my chest. I spun around, but the door was already shut tight, the latch clicking into place. I was trapped. When I turned back to Emily, her face was pale, her lips trembling, and her eyes wide. "John, do you feel it? Something is here." I didn't have to answer. I felt it too. We were no longer just in the house. The house was in us, and something inside it was waking up. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't just visitors. We were the next ones. I don't know what made us pick this house. Maybe it was the isolation, the promise of a fresh start far away from the mess we left behind. Emily and I, we were desperate. We needed a new beginning. A place where no one knew our names, no one knew our mistakes. So, we drove until the city's grasp loosened, until it disappeared in the rearview mirror, leaving only empty roads and the dense forest that seemed to swallow everything around it. The house wasn't much to look at, an old, crumbling thing hidden on the edge of town. It stood alone, its stone foundation cracked and uneven, its windows dark and watchful. The moment we pulled up to it, I felt the weight of the place pressing down on me. The trees surrounding it seemed to crowd in on the house, their twisted branches reaching out like fingers, trying to keep us from leaving. There was something unsettling about it, but I brushed it off. We were here for a fresh start, after all. But even as I stood there, looking at the decaying walls and sagging roof, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had been waiting for us, that it had been empty for too long, holding its breath, just waiting for someone to fill it with life, or something else. "Are you sure this is the one?" Emily asked, her voice hesitant as she glanced up at the house. I didn't want to admit it, but the truth was, I wasn't sure. My stomach twisted in knots, but I forced a smile. "It's perfect. It's exactly what we need." But as we stepped out of the car and into the cool, silent air, I realized I wasn't convincing anyone, not even myself. That first night felt different. The house was old, yes, but there was something else to it. Something alive. It wasn't just the creaks of the floorboards or the groans of the walls. It was something deeper, something that made the air feel thick, suffocating. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching us, judging us, like it knew exactly who we were and what we had come to escape. We tried to make ourselves at home, moving the furniture around, unpacking boxes, but nothing seemed to settle right. The silence was too loud, too constant. It pressed in on us like a weight we couldn't escape. Emily didn't seem to notice, or maybe she just didn't want to acknowledge it. She kept moving around the house, trying to make it feel cozy, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting something to follow her. I tried to distract myself with mundane things, checking the lights, testing the plumbing, but it didn't help. The house felt wrong. I could feel it in my bones, in the way the air turned colder as the evening wore on. Eventually, we settled into the living room, the dim light from a single lamp flickering on the table between us. Emily curled up on the sofa, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes flickering nervously around the room. "I'm sure it's just the house settling," I said, more to myself than to her, trying to make sense of the growing unease that had taken root inside me. But Emily didn't reply. She was staring at the far corner of the room, her eyes wide and unblinking. Her fingers gripped the edges of the sofa, her knuckles turning white. I followed her gaze, but there was nothing there. Just the same peeling wallpaper, the same old furniture. Nothing to explain the strange feeling crawling under my skin. "It's probably just the wind," I muttered, though I wasn't sure I believed it. The air outside had grown still, heavy, as though even nature was holding its breath. The silence stretched out between us, unbearable. And that's when I heard it. A low, almost imperceptible whisper. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. It was coming from the corner of the room, just out of sight. "John." I turned quickly, my eyes darting to the corner, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, still. Emily didn't seem to notice. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Emily blinked and looked at me, her face pale. "Hear what?" "That," I stopped myself, swallowing. Never mind, probably nothing. But the whisper had been real. I felt it. I could still hear it echoing in my mind, that voice calling my name, so faint it could have been a dream. But I knew it wasn't. I moved toward the hallway, feeling the weight of the house pressing in on me, suffocating me with its silence. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I walked, the sound unnaturally loud, as if the house itself were listening. I passed the kitchen and paused in the doorway. The air felt colder here, a sharp chill that cut through my clothes. The shadows in the corners seemed to grow deeper, darker, as if they were reaching toward me. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. A flicker in the corner of my eye. A shadow moving too quickly, too smoothly to be real. I blinked. Nothing. But my skin was crawling. I had to get out of here. I had to... "John!" I spun around. Emily stood at the edge of the hallway, her face pale and wide-eyed, her hand trembling at her side. "Did you hear that?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The house was breathing, the walls shifting, the shadows crawling across the floor. I couldn't make sense of it. I wanted to run, but my feet wouldn't move. "John." "Something's wrong," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "Something's here." I didn't have time to answer her. I turned and ran back toward the living room, but as I did, I saw it again, the shadow. But this time, it wasn't just a flicker, it was growing, moving across the walls, its edges sharp and hungry. The shadows were stretching, creeping toward us, curling around the corners of the room like fingers reaching for our souls. "Emily, get out of here!" I screamed, my heart pounding in my chest. But she didn't move. She was frozen, staring at the shadows, her eyes wide in terror. "John, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rising crescendo of whispers filling the room. And then I understood. The house wasn't just old, it wasn't just empty, it was alive. and it had been waiting for us to arrive, to feed on our guilt, our fear, the dark things we'd buried deep inside. The shadows weren't just shadows, they were us. They were our deepest fears and regrets, clawing their way into reality, twisting everything we thought we knew about ourselves. I reached for Emily, but the shadows were faster, reaching for her first. They curled around her, pulling her into the darkness. Her scream echoed in my ears, but I couldn't pull her free. The shadows were too strong. And then they turned on me. I could feel them inside my head, crawling beneath my skin, feeding on my fear. The house was no longer just a house. It was a prison, a twisted reflection of everything we had tried to leave behind. And the shadows, they were never going to let us go. The door slammed shut behind me. I could feel the walls closing in, the darkness wrapping itself around me. We were trapped, and the shadows were only getting stronger. We didn't know what we were walking into. No one ever does. But we were desperate for a fresh start. Anything to outrun the mistakes, the memories that clung to us like dust, the weight that had followed us everywhere. So when we found this house, hidden away on the edge of nowhere, we saw it as our escape, a new beginning. We thought we could leave it all behind, but now, standing here, staring at it as the sun dipped below the horizon, I could feel it. Something in the air, heavy and thick, pressing down on me like a weight. The trees around the house were too still, their twisted limbs reaching out toward us like the fingers of something long forgotten, something wrong. And the house, it felt like it was waiting for us, like it had been waiting for me. I tried to ignore it. I wanted to believe in the possibility of starting fresh, of burying everything we had left behind. Emily was excited, of course. She always saw the best in everything. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a mistake, that the house wasn't just a house. It was something else. The first night was when I should have known, when I should have turned around, packed everything back into the car, and driven as far away as I could, but I didn't. Neither of us did. It was late when we finally got the last of the boxes unpacked. The house seemed to groan with every movement, every shift of the floorboards, like it was waking from a long, tortured sleep. The only light came from a single lamp in the living room, its flickering bulb casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and grow, reaching across the room like fingers reaching for us. The house felt alive, and every shadow in it felt like a threat. Emily was sitting on the old, sagging couch, flipping through a box of books. I was standing by the window, watching the night settle over the land. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees outside, but it only added to the suffocating silence of the house. "I'm sure it's just the house settling," I said, trying to convince myself as much as her. But even as I said it, I felt the tension in the air, like the house was pressing down on me, forcing me to acknowledge something I wasn't ready to face. Emily glanced up from her book, her eyes wide with unease. "Do you feel that? It's like the air is thick." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I felt it too, the weight of it, like the house was pressing down on us, suffocating us with its secrets. Every creak of the floorboards, every shift in the walls, was like a heartbeat in the dark. I could feel it beneath my skin. Something was watching us. Something was here in the shadows, waiting. "I'll go check the rest of the house," I muttered, my voice a little tighter than I intended. I needed to move. I needed to do something before the dread in the air swallowed me whole. I moved through the house, my footsteps too loud, too intrusive against the silence. The hallway was long and narrow, the walls closing in on me with every step. The dim light from the living room flickered behind me, casting the hallway into sharp relief. But the farther I walked, the darker it became. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to lengthen, stretching toward me, their edges curling like fingers. I felt them reach for me, like the walls were alive, pulling me in. The kitchen was cold, too cold. The fridge hummed in the corner, a low, mechanical sound that felt out of place in the stillness. The shadows were deeper here, more alive, pulsing with something I couldn't name. As I stepped further into the room, I thought I saw something move in the corner of my eye. Just a flicker, a shadow darting across the wall. I stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. There was nothing there when I looked, but the air was thick with it. Something wasn't right. I turned back toward the door, ready to leave the kitchen behind, but then I heard it. A whisper. Faint. Almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. John. I froze, my blood running cold. The whisper had come from somewhere inside the room, from just beyond my reach. My mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. Was it the wind? The house settling? But the whisper was too clear, too direct to be ignored. It wasn't the house. It was something else. John. The voice came again, this time louder, more distinct, and it sent a chill down my spine. I spun around, my heart thundering in my chest, but there was nothing. Nothing in the kitchen except the shadows, which seemed darker now, thicker. I had to get out of there. I rushed back to the living room, my feet stumbling over the uneven floorboards, the creaks too loud in the silence. When I entered, Emily was sitting on the couch, her face pale, her hands clenched in her lap. She looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "John," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Did you hear it?" I didn't need to ask what she meant. The air in the room was heavy, thick with something I couldn't name, something suffocating. The shadows had grown, stretched deeper now, curling around the furniture, creeping toward us like dark, silent creatures. "Emily, we need to leave," I said, my voice cracking. My feet were rooted to the floor, my body paralyzed by fear. The shadows were everywhere now, closing in from all sides. But she didn't move. She didn't even blink. She was staring at something in the corner of the room, something I couldn't see, her eyes wide with terror. "There's something in the corner," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Something watching us." I turned, my heart in my throat, and then I saw it. The shadows, darker than the rest, curling and writhing in the corner of the room, as though they had a life of their own. They seemed to reach for us, pulling us into them, their shapes distorting, stretching into grotesque forms. The air grew colder, thicker. The house itself seemed to be alive, breathing with us, wrapping around us like a trap. And then, just as I thought I couldn't bear it anymore, I heard the doorbell ring. Who could possibly be here at this hour? My mind screamed. Who would even find this place? I didn't want to answer it, but something in me, something I couldn't explain, pulled me toward the door. I opened it, and there, standing in the doorway, was an old woman. Her long, silver hair tumbled down her back, her face drawn and weathered, like it had been etched into the fabric of time. Her eyes were pale, almost white, and when she looked at me, it felt like she was looking straight into my soul, seeing things I didn't want her to see. "I warned you," she said in a rasping voice, her words chilling me to the bone. "This house is cursed. It feeds on you." I froze, the words not fully registering. "What? Who are you?" She didn't answer. She just stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes. "You should have listened." And with that, she turned and walked away, vanishing into the night as quickly as she had appeared. The door slammed shut behind me. and I stood there for a long time, staring at the dark, empty space where she had stood. The shadows, now stretching toward me, seemed to grow stronger with each passing second, pulling us deeper into their grip. And I knew with a terrifying certainty that we were too late. The house had already claimed us. There was no escaping it now. We were trying to outrun our past. We thought a fresh start in a new house, far from the noise and chaos of everything that had gone wrong, would fix things. So when we found this place, isolated and tucked away on the edge of nowhere, it seemed perfect. A little run down, sure, but what better way to leave behind the ghosts of our former lives? We were foolish to think we could escape. The moment we stepped into the house, I felt it. Something in the air, thick and heavy. It clung to me, wrapping around me like a shroud. The house was ancient. The walls creaked under the weight of years, and the shadows were alive. That first night was when the house made itself known. I can still remember it. The oppressive silence, the weight of the air pressing in on us. The kind of silence that isn't really silence, but the stillness of something waiting, watching. And those shadows, they weren't like any shadows I'd ever seen before. They moved slowly, deliberately, creeping along the walls and floors like they had a mind of their own. It was as if they were watching us, studying us, feeding on the fear we didn't know we had. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling, that it was old, and that creaks and groans were normal. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Something was wrong with this place. Something was watching us. And it wasn't just the house. It was the shadows. The first warning came in the form of an old woman. She appeared out of nowhere, standing at the edge of our driveway one evening, her long, silver hair falling around her face like a veil. She was dressed in dark, faded clothes, her face weathered by time. And when she looked at me, it felt like she could see right through me, like she knew everything I'd buried deep inside. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice rasping like it came from somewhere ancient, far older than anything the house could have known. "This house is cursed." I laughed at first. I mean, who wouldn't? A house being cursed. That's just some old woman's superstition, right? But when she looked at me, really looked at me, I stopped laughing. Her eyes were pale, almost lifeless, and they were fixed on me with an intensity that sent a cold shiver through my spine. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaking with urgency. "It feeds on your fears, your guilt. The more you ignore it, the stronger it gets. It will never let you go." I brushed her off, of course. We were just looking for something to explain the dread we'd already begun to feel. But deep down, I knew she was right. The house knew us. And it wasn't just the house. It was something inside of us. Something we couldn't escape. The night the shadows grew stronger, I could feel them closing in on us. The air grew heavier, thicker, suffocating. It felt like we were trapped in the belly of the house, like it was holding us in a vice, squeezing tighter with every passing moment. The walls seemed to press in on us, and every creak of the floorboard sounded like footsteps behind us, breathing down our necks. Emily and I sat in the living room, not speaking, just existing. She was pale, her eyes wide and distant, her hands trembling in her lap. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, curling and twisting like serpents, inching closer to us, inching closer to her. I tried to talk to her, to make her look away from the corner of the room, but she was frozen, staring at something that wasn't there, or maybe was. The shadows were growing larger now, moving in ways I couldn't explain, like they were alive, reaching toward us. "Emily," I said, my voice breaking. "What's happening?" But she didn't answer. She couldn't. Her gaze was locked onto the shadows, her body tense, her face pale. She was already slipping away, already falling into whatever nightmare the house had prepared for her. And then I heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, but it grew louder, clearer, like it was coming from inside my head. A voice. No, not a voice. Something else. Something dark. John. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. But there was no one there, just the shadows, stretching, growing, shifting. And then, just as quickly as the voice had come, it was gone. But the shadows didn't stop. They crept closer, closer still. I could feel them curling around my feet, wrapping around my legs, tugging at me. I tried to pull away, but they were stronger than I was. They were dragging me in, pulling me toward them, pulling me toward her. Emily's scream pierced the silence, a raw, guttural sound that shattered my thoughts. I turned to see her, her eyes wide with terror, her hands reaching out to me, but the shadows had already wrapped themselves around her, pulling her into them, swallowing her whole. I ran to her, my hands reaching for hers, but the shadows yanked me back. It was like trying to pull someone out of quicksand. The harder I pulled, the deeper the shadows dragged her. "Emily!" I screamed, my voice breaking as the darkness closed in around us. The walls seemed to shift, the room seemed to fold, and I was no longer sure where I was, where she was. Everything was wrong. The shadows were everywhere now, surrounding us, pressing in on us from all sides. The house was no longer just a house. It was a trap. A living thing that was suffocating us, devouring us from the inside out. And then I understood. The house didn't just want us. It needed us. It needed our guilt, our fear. The shadows were not just shadows. They were the physical manifestation of everything we'd buried, everything we'd tried to outrun. And the more we struggled, the stronger they became. I could feel them in my chest, in my bones, in my very soul, dragging out all the secrets I'd kept buried. The truth I had buried about my brother, about the accident, about the lies I'd told Emily, about the things I'd hidden from everyone. All of it was coming out now. The house had pulled it all to the surface, and the shadows were feeding on it. "Emily, we have to go," I gasped, my chest tightening. But the words didn't feel right anymore. We couldn't leave. The door slammed shut. The walls pressed in. The shadows were closing around us, devouring us, pulling us under, dragging us into the darkness. And just as I felt myself slipping, just as the shadows overwhelmed me, I knew one thing. We were already gone. And the house, it would never let us go. We thought we were leaving everything behind, that a new house in the middle of nowhere would be the fresh start we so desperately needed, a chance to escape our past. But I should have known better. The moment we stepped into this house, I felt it, an unease that settled in my chest like a weight I couldn't shake off. It wasn't just the creaking of the old walls or the musty air. It was something deeper, something alive. The first night felt like a warning. It was the shadows that did it. They moved, shifted across the walls, reaching toward us like they had minds of their own. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that I was overthinking it, but I wasn't. They were real, and they were watching us. Emily was different too. She tried to remain calm, to make this place feel like home, but I saw it in her eyes, the fear. She felt it too. The house was changing her, and it was changing me. We were both trapped in it, sinking deeper with every passing hour. The shadows weren't just in the corners anymore, they were everywhere. Every room, every hallway, suffocating us, closing in. The first warning came in the form of the old woman. She appeared out of nowhere, standing at the foot of our driveway one evening, her silver hair wild against the darkening sky. Her face was pale, her clothes worn, and her eyes, they were like hollows, empty and searching. I didn't know what to think at first. She looked like someone from another time, someone who didn't belong in this world. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice raspy, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. "This house, it's cursed." I laughed, of course. Who wouldn't? A curse. It sounded absurd. But when she looked at me, really looked at me, her gaze bore into me, and I felt something shift inside me. Something dark, something old. She was no ordinary woman. "You don't understand," she continued, her voice shaking now, her hand reaching toward the house. "It feeds on fear, your guilt. The more you ignore it, the stronger it becomes. It will never let you go." I tried to brush her off. We had just moved in, and I needed to believe this place would be our sanctuary. But when she turned away, disappearing into the trees, her words clung to me. "It will never let you go." And I realized then that maybe she wasn't just talking about the house. Maybe she was talking about me, about us. The house wasn't just haunted. It was feeding on something deeper, something inside of us. The following days passed in a blur. Emily and I moved through the house like ghosts, our voices barely louder than whispers. The shadows kept growing, twisting and writhing at the edges of my vision. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like they were alive, suffocating me with every breath I took. It was as if the house was becoming a part of me, pulling me in, reminding me of things I had buried, things I hadn't even known I feared. And then, one night, it happened. I was sitting in the living room, staring into the dim glow of the flickering lamp. Emily sat across from me, curled into herself, her hands wrapped tightly around her knees. She hadn't said a word for hours, but I could feel her eyes on me. I knew she was just as terrified as I was. I should have said something. I should have told her it would be okay. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because the house had already taken us. It had already claimed us, and we hadn't even realized it. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered suddenly, her voice trembling. I froze. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. But beneath that silence, beneath it all, I heard something else. A whisper. Soft at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. "John." My heart skipped a beat. I turned to Emily, but her eyes were wide, locked onto the corner of the room, her gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. She was terrified, and I was too. "John." The voice came again, louder this time, a sharp hiss that cut through the stillness like a cold breath in my ear. It wasn't just a voice anymore, it was a presence, something ancient, something hungry, feeding on the fear that had begun to grow between us. "Emily," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper, my throat tightening with dread. "What is it? What's happening?" But she didn't answer. She was still staring at the corner, her hands trembling as she clutched her knees harder, as if she were trying to hold herself together. The shadows were stretching toward her now, curling around her like dark vines, pulling her into them. "Emily." I reached for her, but the shadows recoiled, pushing me back, pulling her deeper. Her body jerked in response as if the darkness had a hold of her now, just as it had a hold of me. I tried again to grab her, but the shadows were everywhere now, swarming over me, dragging me down. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thicker with every passing second. I could feel it, the house tightening its grip on us, suffocating us, pulling us toward the darkness. I could hear the whispers, the voices now a chorus of distorted, hateful words. They were inside my head, filling me with every mistake, every regret, every ounce of guilt I'd ever tried to bury. They were feeding on it, twisting it into something monstrous, something that was not me anymore. "John," the voice hissed again, louder this time, echoing in my skull. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The shadows were taking everything from me, my strength, my will, my thoughts, and soon they would take Emily too. I had to save her. I had to pull her out of this nightmare. But the shadows were too strong. They were everywhere, inside us, around us, feeding on our souls. And then, as the darkness reached its peak, something shifted. I saw it then, in that fleeting moment when everything seemed to still. Emily's eyes flickered, just for a second, a flicker of recognition. She was still there. She wasn't lost completely. I grabbed her hand, pulling her toward me with everything I had left. The shadows screamed, recoiling from the strength of our connection, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. The darkness was stronger than both of us, stronger than anything I had ever felt before. I had to save her. "Emily, please, don't let them take you." My voice broke as I pulled harder, but the shadows were pulling back, stronger now, drawing her into them. My body was shaking, the weight of everything pressing down on me. "Please," I cried again, my hands slipping from hers. But just as I thought it was over, as I thought the house had finally consumed us completely, I felt it. A single spark, a flicker of light. It was love. It was all I had left. I pulled with everything I had, reaching into the deepest parts of myself, into the love I still had for her, into the promise I'd made to protect her. And for a moment, the shadows faltered. The darkness recoiled, just long enough for us to escape, to break free. But not entirely. As we ran toward the door, toward the light, I felt it. The house, the shadows, they were still there. They would always follow us, always be a part of us. Because once you step inside, there is no leaving, no escaping the guilt, no outrunning the darkness that lives inside of you. And as we fled, gasping for breath, I knew one thing for sure. The house had claimed us, and the shadows, they would always be with us. Thank you for venturing into the shadows with me here at Frightful Whispers. Remember, the darkness holds secrets, but also whispers truths to those who dare to listen. If tonight's tale sent shivers down your spine, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep the fire of fright alive. Rest easy, but keep one eye open, for the night is never truly still. Until we meet again, stay vigilant, stay curious, and let the whispers guide you.